afternoon and welcome to the second day of the BFI Future Film Festival. I'm Laura Boswell, Head of Futures and Skills at the BFI. I'm really delighted to welcome you to our session on how to be a successful freelancer in the screen industries with Edie Smockum from ThinkBigger and David Thomas. Edie and David have a wealth of experience of running training programs for Screen Skills, Channel 4, ITV, and many other media organisations, and are perfectly placed to offer advice on how you can thrive as a freelancer in the screen industries. You'll notice today that we're in webinar format, so please do use the chat box to introduce yourselves, which I can absolutely see you're doing already unprompted, and put in there any comments that you have about the session. Fiona from the Future Film Festival team will be managing the chat box and answering any questions that you have about the BFI or about the festival. If you have any questions on the session for Edie or David, please put them in the Q&A box. Winnie from my team will be managing this, and we have time at the end of the session to make sure we can answer as many of your questions as possible. I wanted to let you know that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the BFI YouTube channel after the festival. But that's it for me for now, and I would love to introduce you to Edie to start this afternoon's session.
Hi everyone, hello. It's really nice that you've all joined us here this afternoon, and I would like to thank the BFI very much for inviting David and myself. We are both really keen supporters of new people getting into the industry and the industry more broadly, so we are delighted to be here on a Friday afternoon. I'm really excited by the title of this session this afternoon because it's about how to be a successful freelancer. And I think, wow, that is a big, big title for us. And I think what David will cover with you when I finish nattering here will guarantee that you will, be more prepared to be a good and successful freelancer. And once you finish this session, I hope that you go away with a lot of confidence that you know how to organize yourself to be a freelancer. I think that the first thing that you've done by being here this afternoon suggests that you actually want to be a successful freelancer, and you're looking at the business end as well as the creative end. So well done, everybody. A big clap to everybody for actually doing that, because it's so important. And David and I often meet people who are well into their careers who haven't actually sort of engaged with this part of the business. And it's really, really important as a freelancer that you manage your money, that you figure out how you're going to live, and you're figuring out how you're going to make a living out of it. So I'm going to give you a couple of other things that I think would be really, really useful for you to do. So these are just going to be a little list, and then I'm going to turn over to David. So the first thing I would suggest to be a successful freelancer is that you try to work for good people, okay? You'll recognize good people. They'll be really clear about what they're actually asking you to do. They'll be clear about the hours that they're asking you to work, and they'll be clear about the length of the project and where the project is likely to end up. So make sure that you're actually asking questions if people want you to come and work on their film, what the film's about and what is expected of you. Try to work only for people who treat you well. It's really, really important in this industry that we build an industry that people want to work in and that people actually feel valued in. And I think it's really important for both David and myself that everybody who's working in the industry feels valued for what they're doing and is appreciated for what they're doing. It'll make the whole bit of your career much, much, much happier. There are lots and lots of different jobs in the industry, and I know that a lot of you are at the starting stages of your industry. So, experiment a bit. Sometimes people start out thinking they want to be one thing, and actually they do something else for a while and find out actually they're a much better fit for that. It isn't always what you set out to do. So give yourself lots of leeway to try a few things out and to try a few jobs out and think, actually, I really like that. Let me do a bit more of that. And also, if you end up somewhere and you think, actually, I really hated that, then just leave it. Try something else in the industry. It's a really, really broad industry. And I'm sure that you're going to find something that you actually like to do in it. I'll just mention one more time, that anytime you're working for somebody, make sure that they're not asking too much for you. You should never be in a position where you feel overwhelmed by the job you're doing, or you're being too challenged in the job you're doing. One of the best people I've ever worked with in the industry, who's an old hand line producer, always used to say to me, the great thing about the film industry is each time you take on a new job, you should be biting off a little more than you can chew, but just a little more. So whatever you do, make sure that you're capable of doing the job, that it's challenging for you, and that it's something that actually is going to help you progress your career. When you're working for people, and that could be somebody who's sort of, managing you that day, or somebody who's the head of department if you're in the camera team, whoever it is, make sure that they're giving you references, giving you a network, that you're keeping in touch with them, because this is an industry that people will tell you over and over again, you need a network of people to keep you working in it. And that's really, really important. So make sure that you're collecting names of people, that you know how to email them, that you're connecting with them on social media, so that you've actually, over the course of the first sort of couple of years in the industry, you have a whole network of people that you can draw on to help you with work. And always make sure that you're nice to everybody that is on whatever set you're working on, or whatever location you're working on, because actually that's the greatest thing to get you recommended in the future. It's really, really important to be a successful freelancer, is to be liked by people, and to make sure that you're being kind to everybody is really, really helpful. Try to get advice from people. So if you're working with a particularly fantastic, director of photography, or if you're working with a really brilliant art director, ask them for advice, because it's really, really important to find out how people have got on in the industry. It's really important to find out what might be coming up. It is really important to understand what they did to get where they are. The only thing I would say about that is listen really carefully to what they have to say, but always remember that free advice is kind of worth, sometimes what you pay for it. So if you feel that somebody's not kind of, is being a bit grumpy, or isn't giving you advice, and there's a lot of negativity around freelancing in the industry, so make sure you're kind of taking things with a pinch of salt, that you know what I mean, that you're sort of listening, but you're also deciding for yourself whether this person is actually giving you good advice or not. And finally, before I hand over to David, what I really want to say, and please, if you listen to nothing else that I've said, listen to this, please enjoy the film industry. It is one of the best jobs in the world. And I think you need to ignore all of those people who tell you otherwise. It's a great place to be. It's a terribly creative place to be. The United Kingdom does it particularly well. And I think that it's a brilliant future, and a great, you get a really great feeling from working in a team and pulling a film off. So I wish you all very, very well before I pass over to David for David to start. And I hope you enjoy David's session. Listen carefully.
Thank you, Edie. It's very nice to see you all, or at least see that you're here. Thank you very much for inviting me along, BFI. I tend to tour the country talking about the business side of being freelance. My background is actually production. So I'm going to talk about some businessy bits. And sometimes that can make me sound like I'm an accountant or somebody like that, or a business advisor. I'm really not. I'm someone who really enjoys production. But I have been freelance for the last 15 years running a training business. So I've had to learn that it's not just enough to be creative. You also have to understand what it's like to be a small business when you're freelancing. And that is a good mentality. It's think like a business. Now, I often run training, which is half a day or even a day. So what I want to do today is just to alight on a few important aspects that can just drop some thoughts into your head. And then obviously we can have questions again after 3 o'clock. So looking forward to that too. I think the point that Edie made about enjoying work is very important, but you'll enjoy things more if you also nurture the business side of your brain. So if you think a little bit about what it's like to be running as a one-person business as a freelancer, that's going to get you a bit more self-confidence. It'll make you feel more self-assured, and it'll also make you spot where other people are more ignorant than you, which always makes you feel pretty good. So I'm going to share my slides with you. And these slides, by the way, and everything I show you in the next session, this is all going to be available as downloads off my website. And I'm going to explain where you can get those. Everything's for free. and I will make sure you know where to get them after we've finished the session. So first of all, to say that I think there are 4 areas that are worth talking about today. Assessing what we mean by freelance and the different options for the way that you run yourself as freelance. We're going to look at that first. The second thing will be, we're going to look at how you look into the future and work out how not to run out of money. I know that sounds a bit glib, but a lot of freelancers find that a very challenging thing, is to make sure you've got enough cash as you go through the coming year, for example. So we're going to look at how to do that, a very important skill to learn as a freelancer. The third thing is, what do we mean by the market and how it works? So we'll touch on that. Edie's very good at that as well, and has already mentioned 1 or 2 things around there, but I've got a couple of other thoughts on that, which are more to do with trying to quantify how work works when you're freelancing. And finally, a little bit about record keeping. I know that sounds like we're going to talk about filing systems, but it's going to be more exciting than that, I can assure you. And you'll have noticed, if you're eagle-eyed, that we've got A, E, I, and O as the beginning letters here. I think that's an accident, but there we are. So let's start with the A, assessing your freelance options. What do we mean by that? Well, when you start out in your career, you may think that there's people who are employed and there are people who are freelance, but it's not quite as simple as that when you start looking at the business side of it. And if we're talking about how tax and things work, we need to understand what we mean by the word freelance. So the first question I'm throwing up on the screen for you is, actually, when we say freelance, what do we mean by that? What kind of freelancer are you? Now, there are 3 types of freelancer that are the types of ways of earning money where people will use that term freelance, but they're not the same, and they're not going to be taxed the same, and the money flows in different ways. And it can be really confusing for people, especially when they start their careers, where they may be starting at PAYE at this end. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Or maybe they think they're a sole trader, but they have to know. And sometimes I meet people who, when they're taking on work, they're really not sure before they start the work which one of these is going to be the freelance type that they are. And it is important to know before you start working. The limited company freelancer is probably further down the line for many people, but it's where you set up a company which you run and you're the only person in it and you're working through your own company. I'm not going to major on that today because we don't really have time, but I will explain how that's different, for example, from being a sole trader. So this is quite technical in many ways, but it's such an important thing that we couldn't really talk about being successfully freelance without at least mentioning it. Now, the word freelance doesn't actually appear in the tax office. This may surprise you. The tax office and the government, they don't talk about the word freelance. People, when they work for someone else, are either paid as employed or they're paid as self-employed. So you can see we've got 3 different types of freelancer: PAYE, sole trader, and limited, but they have to fit into just 2 ways of getting paid by other people. And that can on its own cause a mismatch and a bit of confusion. So let's just look at the first 2, the PAYE freelancer, which is actually where many people do start their careers, and then also the sole trader freelancer. And let's compare the 2 and briefly look at the way that things can work when you're paid in either of these scenarios. So if you are someone who's working in film, it's very likely, if you're in a junior role, that you're going to be paid as a PAYE freelancer. And what that means is you'll be paid as an employed person, even if it's only for a day or for a week or for very short periods of time. It doesn't have to be for long periods. Often people in assistant roles or trainee roles or runner roles have to be paid this way, which means that the organization that's giving you the money will put you on a payroll. They're paying you as if you're an employee. And that's why we call them PAYE freelancers, because the PAYE is the pay as you earn system, which is what happens when you're paid through a payroll. And what you're paying as you earn, PAYE, is income tax and national insurance that are sorted out by the employer. So the employer does all that for you, and you receive the money that's remaining in whatever you've been promised after they've taken off things like tax, national insurance. Now, that's going to be for many people when they start out, but you also find quite early in people's careers, if they are in certain job roles where they have their own equipment, and they are moving from place to place with their own kit, they're very often people who can set up as a sole trader. So this is what the government calls self-employed. But self-employed is quite a specific term when we talk about operating as a worker or tax, when we talk about tax. Self-employed means you're registered as a sole trader. And sole trader is a technical term. That's why I've put it in inverted commas there on the screen. And when you're working as a sole trader, you're actually running a sole trader business. So that means that if you're running a business formally, and that's what the tax office says you're doing, it means that we call the income turnover. In fact, people who set up as self-employed sole traders, what usually happens is they're invoicing, and whatever they're invoicing for comes in as effectively business income. And there's a special word for that, turnover. I won't throw much jargon at you today, don't worry. But the word turnover is a really useful one, because turnover just means what you receive when you're running a business. It should be said that you can be employed for some jobs and self-employed for other ones. So quite commonly, in fact, in my work, I will meet people who are going to be freelancing. Some of them have PAYE work, and they do certain jobs which are maybe junior. They're paid through the payroll. They have tax and national insurance taken off for those jobs by an employer. Meanwhile, they do other work where they've set up this sole trader business, which runs on the work which they do for other clients. And it's perfectly okay to be both of those. They're side by side. Obviously, they're for different jobs, but you don't have to choose to be one or the other. It's going to be the jobs that you do that's going to dictate whether you're one or the other. And the most important thing, as we'll see before we finish today, is that you don't mix up the record keeping for either of those. So we'll talk about the record keeping later. If you are operating as a sole trader, then you fill in a tax return. It's called self-assessment. And when you do a tax return at the end of each tax year, what happens is you tell them what your turnover was for the year that's just finished, and also what your business related expenses were for the costs that are there because you're running a business formally. And you put in figures of turnover, figures of expenses, and you're taxed on the difference between the two. So turnover minus expenses is the profit figure. And that's the thing that you're taxed on when you're a sole trader. So this is why I'm even going to talk about record keeping, because we need to find ways of keeping track of what we mean by expenses as a business, for example, how to keep records so that you know what to put if you're doing a tax return. And by the way, if some of you are thinking, well, hang on a minute, why don't I just get an accountant? You don't actually necessarily need an accountant. It's not compulsory, but there's quite a lot you could do, even if you have one. And if you had an accountant helping you, they will charge you less if you're doing some of the record keeping yourself, because they'll just have a lot less to do. So this is why it's quite important that we go through this. It's part of being self-confident as a freelancer. So the tax office knows about you as a freelancer if you're sole trader, because you've told them in a tax return, which you have to do at the end of each tax year. But how does the tax office know about you if you're employed? Well, the employer has to tell the tax office what they're paying you and how much tax and national insurance has been taken off whatever you've been paid. They do that using special reporting software, and it's called real-time information, this information. So the tax office already knows about you when you've received money, PAYE, which is a bit spooky, but that's because the employer has to tell the tax office on the day or before the day that they pay you. You'll be taxed on your income, and the tax that's used is called income tax. We're not going to go through it in detail today, but income tax is a really useful tax to understand, because it's how you're taxed when you're normally paid as an employee, but it's also the tax that's used to tax your profit. So if you're a sole trader and you've got profit, that's the figure that gets plugged into the tax calculation. So income tax is the important tax to understand, probably more important than any other tax that you just get your head around at how it works. A sole trader is a type of business. I mentioned that. I'm just highlighting that very overtly on the screen for you. So a turnover is what you get when you invoice. You might also have other income if you're PAYE, of course, if you were operating as a sole trader. But a reminder that you're taxed on profit, which is turnover minus business expenses. Now, this is one type of business, but there is another type of business. And another type of business, which sometimes people use when they freelance, is a limited company business. I'm going to just touch on this. I don't want to linger on it too long, but the limited company business is where somebody who wants to freelance sets up a business of their own called a company. And the most important thing to remember about this is that the company is separate from the individual. So if you go into freelancing and you get to the stage where you're going to set up a limited company, you've got to remember that the company is a legal thing, separate from you in law. A company is separate from every human being. It's a unique legal virtual thing. So that means you're running something which is not you. There's a distinction between the two. And that's very different from being a sole trader. The reason it's called sole trader, by the way, is that only you can be your own sole trader business. It's you, the person, is also a business. So it's a person and a business all wrapped up in you. And so there's no distinction between the two. And so why do we have these two different types of business? Well, largely it's because when people start taking bigger risks or taking on more by way of work, which is more complicated, or maybe even bringing in other people to work for them, then if you were doing that as a limited company, then it means the company, which is the business, is managing all that risk. So the company is owning the risks that you run. And to put it in another way, if your business goes horribly wrong and you're running a limited company business, then it's the company that collapses and goes horribly wrong, but you don't lose everything you own. Whereas with a sole trader, it's the other way around, that you are the business. So if your business goes horribly wrong, you go horribly wrong. Now, I'm not suggesting that you're in any way going to go horribly wrong here, folks. So that's not what I'm saying. But that is one of the reasons that the limited company thing exists. It's because it's a separation of the business from the person or the people who are running the business. And it's even true if you're the only person who's running your own business too. I've had experience of both of these. And it's interesting, when I set up my business to be a limited company, I did it to manage risk because I was taking on more and more risky work. But the first thing I noticed was that the turnover, in other words, the business income, goes to the company. It doesn't go to me. And so if you're running a company, you're in a situation where your company gets all the income that you're earning through your own company. So how do you get the money out? Because you've got to go shopping and things, haven't you? Well, you have a salary system. So you are an employee of your own limited company, and you're treated as an employee to the extent that you have a PAYE system, which you set up, and you report the salary, you report the tax and national insurance for your salary. That all gets reported using real-time information, just like any other employee would have that done for them by their employer. Another way of getting money out of a company is through something called dividends. Again, this isn't the place to go through it in detail, but dividends just means profits, which you can take out of a company at a point of your choosing. The tax office doesn't know about dividends until the end of a tax year, because at the end of a tax year, the company has to do its own tax return. So you have to organize that, and it pays corporation tax on its profits. Meanwhile, you have to do a tax return and your dividends are taxed too. So without going into more detail on that, the most important thing here is that you can see that these taxes operate differently and that a limited company setup is more complicated. And that's why it's really important to understand that people normally start PAYE and sole trader status is much, much simpler and is nothing to be frightened of, particularly if you're worried about things like record keeping and tax. Sole trader setup is actually pretty simple. And I'll show you one or two of the things that you need to think about before we finish today. I mentioned income tax is important. It's the tax that's used to tax the turnover of a sole trader. It's also the tax that's used for any employee. So that means that if you're being paid, for example, from your own company or any other company, if you're paid PAYE, income tax is the one that's used. So it's worthwhile just having a quick look here at what do we mean by the tax year and the dates of the tax year. There are some key dates, and this is particularly useful for sole traders to understand, because sole traders, their whole income and their turnover is going to be taxed through the income tax system. So their profits as a sole trader will be taxed through the income tax system. So the tax year is something to get your head around, and there are a couple of dates. In fact, two of them are on the screen already. The 6th of April is the beginning of a tax year, and the 5th of April is the end of a tax year. And each year is looked at on its own. So we don't really mix years up at all. If I just put a second year up on the screen, we can add another important date. So I want you to imagine that what we've got here is an income tax year running in 1 year, followed by a green income tax year, which is the one below it. There is a deadline for you if you're operating as a sole trader to do a tax return. And the tax return deadline, I suspect some of you are aware of this, is the 31st of January. That's an important deadline. By that date, you need to have told the tax office about what happened in the previous year. Now, this is color coordinated, this graphic, because the purple year, which is the first one, that gets reported by the deadline of the following 31st of January. So there's quite a big gap there between the end of a tax year and the deadline for doing the tax return, and that's the self-assessment that you fill in online. And the important thing to say here is that that is a deadline. It's not a target. So don't wait until January. If you want to be really efficient, and I would argue that to be a freelancer, you do not want to be wasting time. You want to be spending all your valuable time having fun, doing your work when you do it, and you do not want to be wasting time on paperwork. So try to make sure that you're as efficient as you possibly can be. So try to get your affairs like a tax return or anything done really early on after the end of the relevant tax year. So don't leave it, because it will just become a real bore for you. There's another deadline of the 31st, which I need to tell you about as well, which is it's also a deadline for paying tax if you owe any for the last tax year. And you get a tax bill just before Christmas, which is a lovely Christmas present, which is the bill that you will be owing to be paid by the end of January. It's not just previous year's tax that you owe, though. It's also half of the year that you're actually in. So that's the green year. And the tax office always sends you that bill with last year's tax owing and half of a forecast, if you like, for the year that you're already in. Because you haven't finished the year you're already in, so you don't know exactly what tax you should be paying, neither does the tax office. So they guess. And they always use the previous year to forecast how much you might earn for that following year. And they ask you to pay half of it by that same deadline. So whenever you are paying tax by the 31st of January, it's sort of what you owe from last year and half of the next year as well. Now, some people worry about this because they say, well, hang on a minute, does that mean I'll have enough money to pay my tax bill? Well, if you ever receive any money that's not been taxed, I would urge you always put 20 to 25% aside. That's if you're a normal standard rate taxpayer. Just put 20% aside or thereabouts. And whenever you get any money in that's not been taxed, put that 20% somewhere else where you're not going to spend it. You can keep it to one side. You will then definitely have enough money left to pay your tax bill when it comes. It's just a way of trying to reduce anxiety about keeping hold of cash so that you have the money that you know you're going to need. You also, when you get into a bit of a rhythm, will find that you may be paying some tax on account in the 31st of July as well. So sole traders often end up paying twice a year, a bit at the end of January and a bit at the end of July, and you get into this sort of rhythm. But as long as you maintain, 20% of whatever you're paid, if it's ever not taxed when you receive it, keep that to one side, you'll be fine. So when we talk about assessing what we mean by freelance, we're saying, are you sure you know how people are paying you? If it's PAYE, well, that means they're going to do all the tax for you and they'll send you a pay slip. And we'll talk about record keeping a little later, and we'll talk about the importance of pay slips. The second thing is then to make sure that if you're a sole trader, that you know that you're going to be paid that way, which means they don't take anything off. So whatever you invoice them, then they should be sending that to you. Now, having assessed what we mean by the word freelance, let's have a look at estimating. This is a skill which many freelancers are not used to doing, and it's such an important one. It's looking into the future. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing the slide and just make a point face to face, which is that we don't know what the future is going to bring. So you can't know the actual future. But what you can do is get used to the idea that you can make a good guess as to how things might happen based on any knowledge that you've got of your personal circumstances. And I'm going to show you a technique for doing that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share with you a sheet which helps you to target how much your personal life costs you. And that will help you also to work out how hard to work. It's a good part of gathering information about your financial situation. So I'm going to show you a sheet, which is a monthly budgeting sheet for freelancers. And it's a spreadsheet. It's one of the templates on my website, which you can download and use. I'm just going to cover off the right-hand side because I want to show you the left-hand side first. This sheet is trying to get you to work out how much does your lifestyle cost you. Some of you might have seen things a little bit like this if you've ever had to borrow money from anybody, like a bank. But it's going to ask you, how much do you think you should be spending, or how much do you actually need to spend each month? So per calendar month, PCM. And what I've done is I've actually just put some sort of typical areas to think about financially. So what you would do is you would have a look at these, and you can change these to make it more personal. You can hack the sheet. So I'm just going to put in some random figures so that I can just show you how this works, because I think this sort of quantifying of the financial situation you're in is a really important skill for freelancers to learn, because it will help you to work out how hard you need to work when you're freelancing as well. I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm just making up figures here. I've just put 450 quid in for food for the month. We could even change this to, let's change it to takeaways, because we're not allowed actually to eat out, are we, at the moment? So there we go. That's the pandemic for you. So I've just, and if you had a hobby, you know, you could stick in 20 quid a month you want to spend on the hobby. Very important that you do keep your hobbies going when you're busy as a freelancer, so that you maintain that sort of optimism and buoyancy. Happy freelancers get more work. Did you know that? And I've also put some stuff in here for savings, by the way. Really good idea as a freelancer when you are thinking about your finances is to think of 3 different types of savings pots. One would be to get through the short term. So this would just be 3 months worth of spending, if you like, and put that somewhere. But you could actually think of it as you putting money aside every month to build up these pots. So even if it's 20 quid that you started putting aside every month for short term, that's a good habit to get into. Same thing with medium term for repairs to the boiler or going on holiday when we're allowed to and things like that. Finally, really good to get into the habit of putting money aside long term. So I put that on this sheet to remind you, have you thought about putting a little bit aside every month, for example, even if it's a tenner a month? It's a great habit to get into if you're at the beginning of a career. Now, we're not going to go into details of where you could do that, but those are the sorts of bits of thinking that are really helpful for freelancers so that you're really successful, not just in the work you do, but you're successful in making sure that that is into a context where you're looking after yourself long term. Now, having put those figures in, we've ended up here. The sheet is telling me that I've just calculated that in this example, my personal life would be £1,254 a month that I would be spending on it. And I've broken it down into those areas. Now, I've also, just to open up again on the right-hand side, I've also just put here a work-related area, which for some freelancers, they find quite helpful. So you can actually put in a subscription for something that's more work-related. So if you were a member of some organization or something, you could put that in there. And that would be a monthly thing. So if it was every month, use that little box up there. If you were the kind of person who bought special equipment every year, and maybe you spend 500 quid a year on kit, this sheet actually just divides it down by 12. And it says, what would £500 a year be on a monthly equivalent? So it's just a way of reflecting on some of the costs, which may be more in a kind of work part of your head rather than just a personal life part of your head. Now, you've therefore then got here a total of 1,315, which is personal life and work costs. If you know how much you are going to be paid on a daily basis, what you can then do is work out how many days you need to earn in a month in order to cover the costs. And many freelancers do actually know how much they're paid on a daily rate basis, or maybe they're paid on a weekly basis, in which case, if it's a 5-day week, just divide it by 5 and you will get the daily equivalent. Now, I'm going to, again, make up a figure because you can plug it into this sheet and it will tell you how many days you need to earn. So if you were going to, for example, be paid £150 a day, the first thing this sheet does is it says, well, £150 is what they're going to pay you, but actually you need to take 20% off for tax and national insurance. So let's say that if you're normally paid 150 quid, you can only spend out of that 120. And it does that calculation for you. And then it says, how many days would you need to work and earn in order for that amount of income to cover the amount that you need to spend in your lifestyle? And this sheet's telling me that with the example I've just given you, it's 11 days of earning in a month at that rate would cover those costs for my lifestyle. Now, the reason I think this is important is it gets you into the habit of quantifying your different financial things as a freelancer. It's too easy for freelancers to say, oh, I'm a freelancer, it's all a bit up in the air. But it doesn't have all to be up in the air. You can actually start to pin down certain things where you can take more control. And one area is this one. It's saying, actually, how hard do I need or want to work in order to make sure that I'm getting enough money in so that I can live? And if you can quantify that, it ends up being a target figure. So a target figure, for example, of 11 days in a month is much, much more healthy as an approach than saying, I need to go out and earn as much as I can, because that's a really unhealthy target. As much as you can is never a target you're going to reach. So I would encourage you to think about your lifestyle in that way so that you quantify it and say, how much do I really want to earn? Put a figure on it and then go out and earn it. It'll make you feel more professional when you're negotiating around fees, for example, and it'll actually make you realize that you do need to be paid for the time that you're offering people when you're working for them. And it will mean you won't encourage yourself to undersell yourself financially either. Now, let's just put that back into the context of estimation of what we're doing in our lives. You can estimate the spending and you can estimate what you might get coming in as a freelancer based on your knowledge. And that's what I'm going to show you now. I promised earlier on, just before we started this session, one of the colleagues at the BFI said they loved a good spreadsheet. So Fiona, this is for you. This is how not to run out of money in the future. And it's a skill I would like all freelancers to learn. And I wish I'd taken this more seriously a little bit earlier on. So cash flow planning, how to plan not to run out of money. This, I'm going to take you through this. It won't take long at all, but I'm going to take you through this so that you get the idea of how important it is. What it does is it looks into the future. You can't know the future, as I said, but what you can do is you can actually paint different future scenarios in your life. And you can say, I wonder what would happen to my money if this happened or if that happened. So as a freelancer, you don't always know exactly what's going to happen, but you can paint different versions of the future to work it out. And the sheet I've got in front of you here runs from January through off to the right-hand side through to December. You can run it for yourself at any point. So you could just do March to February or February to January. You could do whatever you like, but remember, it's all about looking into the future. This is not about capturing information that you have of something that's already happened. It's a glimpse into a possible future. So I'm going to just zoom in on the top bit because this is where the money coming in would be put. And I've set it up in such a way that it doesn't matter what kind of freelancer you are, you can actually put in a guess as to how much money you might get coming in at different parts of the coming 12 months. And the top line would be where you'd put it if you are paid PAYE. So if you're the kind of person who gets paid PAYE, use that top line. That's the most obvious one to use. And you put in the money that you're going to receive. So it's for those of you who might have a little bit of experience, you might also already know roughly how much you might get in a month at different times of the year, particularly if you've been through 12 months of freelancing already. Self-employed people, sole traders in other words, what they do is they invoice and then they wait for the money to arrive. So it's important that if you were self-employed and you were trying to put your turnover in as an estimate to what might come in, you would actually put it in the month the money will arrive. So don't put it in the month you work. Put it in 1 month or perhaps 2 months after you've worked, because if you're going to invoice, you have to wait a month or so before the money will come in. So it's important to remember this. Cash flow planning is about planning the flowing of cash. It's not about when you work, it's when the money's going to come in. I put 2 other sections here in case you get money from a gift, or maybe you rob a bank or something. That's a metaphorical thing. I'm not condoning robbing banks, but if you did, then that money would go in on this other line. And if you get benefits from the state, you can use that line too. Obviously, ignore all the lines that are not relevant. Now, if you put that stuff in, you get a total of all the money flowing into you each month for the coming year. And the bottom section here, this is money going out. And we've done that already. We just did it. So the idea that you know how much your personal life costs you, you put that in here. And this is a cut down version of all those categories, which I showed you a moment ago. And you can put that in. It won't take you long at all. Just guess, put round numbers. Doesn't have to be very accurate. Just stick it in so that you get a feeling for what's going out. And if you've got business stuff you want to put in, you can use this section down here too. Now, the magic of a spreadsheet like this is that it does all calculations for you. And this one that I'm giving you is already set up, so you don't have to know how spreadsheets work. You can just put the figures in and then look at the effect. And the only important line is the line at the bottom. It's so important, it's called the bottom line. And it's called the balance carried forward. And it's telling you at the end of each month, have you run out of money? Or more precisely, will you run out of money based on the scenario that you just gave the sheet? So if you think this amount of money will come in and that amount of money will go out, this is the result. And the bottom line never lies. What it does is it always looks at what you're giving as an estimate, and then it tells you what the effect would be. If the figure is black at the end of a month, you've got money. You won't run out of money. If it's red, it's saying, based on this scenario, you're going to run out of money. And it tells you exactly how much by. Also, if you have any money that owing in tax, you can put that in this sheet to remind yourself that you may have to pay tax at certain points in the year as well. Now, if we make up a whole example here, this is way too small for you to read as it is. We can just put a whole year in front of us. This is something you could do, have a guess, and then ignore every line except the bottom line. And then all you do is you read off the bottom line. And this is you reading the future financially for you as a freelancer. So you're saying to yourself, this is what would happen if the money comes in and goes out in the way I anticipated when I put this in the sheet. If I just roll back this, by the way, I'm going to scroll back to May. Can you see that May is the month where this example says this person will be running out of money? So this is saying you're going to be short by £383 in May. Now, if we just were doing this, we'd probably immediately look at May and say, why? What's the reason I'm thinking I might run out of money here? Well, you anticipated you might not earn so much in May. Maybe that's because you didn't do so much work in April, because that's the sole trader line there. Also in this example, we put in £500 for buying equipment. This is actually the equipment line in the business section. So someone has said to themselves here, I'm going to spend 500 quid on new equipment next May. So they put it in and then they looked at the bottom line. And actually what it tells them is that if they did spend 500, they're going to be short. They're going to run out of money by 383 quid. Now that then gives you some options. So you could say to yourself, well, maybe I won't buy the kit then, maybe I'll buy it later. Or this sheet is telling you if you spent £120 on kit instead of 500, you won't run out of money. It means that bottom line figure won't go black if you spend about 120 quid instead of 500. So the whole point about this is that it's a way of quantifying an issue. It's very easy for a freelancer to get into the frame of mind of saying, oh, I'm just going to run out of money. But that's not actually a very helpful frame of mind. What you need to do is to say, even if I run out of money, exactly how much will I run out by? Because then you can start to eat away at it. You know, it's rather than saying to yourself, I have no money, if you say, I will be short in May of £383, it kind of feels more like something you can deal with. And most people who get used to doing this sort of cash flow planning as a freelancer feel much less anxious financially, because it feels like you're pulling a lever today and it's spotting problems way before they happen, so you can do something about them. So if that's something you want to have a look at, you can download that. I'll remind you where to get it a little bit later. And that's a really important part of taking control financially as a freelancer. The other thing we need to do is going back to our list of four vowels, four things, A, E, I. We've done E, estimating. So this is the encouragement I'm giving you to look into the future and work out what might be different scenarios for yourself. And remember that cash flow planner, you can run it lots of different ways and see what might happen if different things were to happen. Let's imagine you've got more work one month, not another month. You can put that in, and then you could swap it around and say, oh, I wonder what would happen if it were the other way around. And the bottom line will always tell you the effect. So that's a really important estimating skill. The next thing is to think about the way the market works. And Edie mentioned some of these elements about how the market works in her introduction at the beginning of this session. But one of the things I'm really keen about when we talk about how the market works is we talk about how it works on a financial basis as well, on a sort of businessy kind of level. And I've got some thoughts for you, which are typical freelancing assumptions, which are to do with the way you assume you may or may not be able to work as a freelancer when you go through the years to come. I think one of the most important things, and if you're very new at this and you're just getting into the industry, I think it's important that you realize that there are earning days and then there are working days, and they're not quite the same thing. Many times we talk about working when we really mean earning. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that a freelancer is like a one-person business. That's a really good mentality to have. Even if you're not officially a business and you're a PAYE freelancer, have the mentality of somebody who is like running as a one-person business. It means that there are days where you will have to do things where you're working, but you're not going to be earning anything. And I always say that those things that are work for which you're not paid are the things which are you running your business. So I don't mean by this that you work for other people and they don't pay you. That's not what I mean at all. What I mean is, as a freelancer, you've got to spend time looking for work. And that is a job in itself. And it's part of your working time. Don't think of looking for work as part of your personal life. That's something where you do your hobbies and go down Sainsbury's and things like that. But it's going to be things like looking for work, networking, also attending training like you're doing now. This is work for you. This is part of your freelance working time. I presume you're not doing this for pleasure. I don't know, maybe you are. But I always think that skills development is very much part of your working timetable. And the third thing which you're doing is going to be also admin. And that is definitely not part of your personal life. If you think of it part of your working day, then I think that encourages you to think of it as something that you do at certain times of the day or the week, where it's much more work oriented. So any admin or paperwork, invoicing, record keeping, think of it as part of your working time. What this means is that we start the year with 365 days. We then want to knock off a number of days for not working at all. So we're talking about knocking off the weekends. We would end up at a figure of about 220 days if you also have holidays. And you do need holidays, by the way. As a freelancer, make sure you have breaks. So that means that we're targeting a subset of the days available and saying, well, we can only work on some of them. And what some people do when they freelance is they also realize that they are going to be only earning on quite a smaller subset of those working days. So for some people, they halve that and they say, actually, earning days out of the 220 might only be half of that. It's 110. Now, many people do better than that. But it is an important thing to think about, that you won't be able to earn on every working day, and you don't want to be working on every available day. So use that as a way of planning to be a good balanced freelancer who's not working too hard all the time and ignoring other bits in their life. So you can't earn all the year round, and you need to understand for your job role, which parts of the year would you not get any work. Freelancing is about moving around a lot, and it's about having jobs which are fun, working for lovely people and not working for the nasty ones. I would encourage you to do that, but it does mean that you won't have work all the year round. So have you investigated the marketplace to work out what normally happens for people doing your job role? Which parts of the year do they not normally get any work? Such an important thing to find out. And you need to do a bit of research about that, because you're actually a freelancer who's going to fit into an existing market. And I know festivals like this are a really, really good way of understanding how the market works. And then ultimately, I really want to come back to this and nail it. You need to think like a business. That means planning like a business. It means thinking about what it is you have as skills, what it is you'd like to have as skills in the future, maybe what equipment you need to invest in, all sorts of things like that, which are a bit like the business end of things. But don't ignore those. It doesn't stop you having fun as a freelancer, but it does put a structure around it, which will make you feel more secure. And it also makes you feel more in control. And we're always, always looking for how you can feel more in control. So when we're talking about the market, I'm sure you'll have quite a few questions about that as well towards the end of this session. But it's an important part of being a successful freelancer, is really getting to know the marketplace and how you fit into it. Remember, there are plenty of other people doing the kind of job role that you'll be doing. Have you met any experienced ones? Have you asked them? When we're allowed to, take them out for a coffee, have a chat with them and say, look, I'm coming on new to this industry and you're really experienced. Could I just buy you a coffee for half an hour, pick your brains and just ask you how it all works? That's what I did when I started as a freelancer. I took people out for coffees. A lot of coffee was drunk and I made notes. And you can even ask people about things like, what would you normally get charged? You know, would you charge for that kind of thing? How do people get paid? Is it always PAYE? Are you a sole trader? You know, these are all sorts of things you can ask people who are more experienced. So investigate the market. That's the third of our important points. The final one is about record keeping. And I mentioned earlier, there are two main different types of freelancer. We talked about being either employed, which is PAYE, or self-employed. And I thought what I'd do is I would just show you some record keeping tools, which I've got for you, which might help you. One of them is for PAYE. The reason I'm giggling is that I'm going to encourage you, whether you're PAYE or anything else, is please, please, please remember not to leave everything to the end of the year. The most efficient type of record keeping is the record keeping you do as you go along. Now, what do I mean by as you go along? Well, I'll tell you what I do. I do 10 minutes every Friday. So I run a small business. I find that on a Friday, when I'm not training, I'll spend 10 or so minutes just tidying up the records for the week that's just finished. And I find by doing that regularly on the same day, it feels like a normal habit. I mean, it's ridiculous, really, because nobody enjoys doing record keeping. Nobody goes to their grave looking back on their life saying, I wish I'd done a bit more paperwork. You know, I don't think that's us at all, is it? But what I think I would encourage you to do is to take that as an essential, but do it in a way where instead of leaving all your record keeping until perhaps the end of a tax year, you do it every week, say. Because, I mean, I find if I leave it for 2 weeks, I've forgotten what happened in the previous couple of weeks anyway. So what do we mean by record keeping? Okay, PAYE freelancers. Now, you'll notice I've just put at the top here the icon for PAYE freelancers. This is because this is very much purely for people who are paid through the payrolls. You'll notice this icon, by the way, comes up on my website and also on my training materials all the time to really highlight which of the different types of freelancer I'm talking about. So you don't have to do this, but it's quite useful if you have a lot of little bits of PAYE work from here, there, and everywhere. It's another spreadsheet, and you can download it from my website, but all it does is it says, when did you do the work? When did they pay you? What was the tax code that they used on your payslip? What was the amount before they took anything off? And then what did they take off? So if this was for something we did in August, we would just write it in like this. One of the values of doing this is it encourages you to look at your payslips. And as a PAYE worker, your payslip as a freelancer is probably going to be the only thing you get with any records on. And you need to check, did they tax you? Have they remembered to take off national insurance? So this is just a really good way of making it very simple every time you get a payslip. By the way, the my money means that's the money you can go and spend. That's why I'm referring to it as my money. And you just keep on doing it. So you have one of these sheets for each tax year. And every time you do PAYE work, you could do it that way. I've met people who are paid PAYE as freelance, and they have 50 different jobs in a year. And so they find this really helpful because it means they can keep a track of the fact that people have paid them as they should, But if they ever have a query and they maybe want to ring the tax office helpline, the tax office might say, what does it say in your pay slips? And so actually you've got it all in front of you in one place. So it's a really helpful thing, even though it's not compulsory. Slightly more compulsory is the last thing I want to show you, which is a thing which is what you need to keep if you're self-employed. Now this, as you can see, we've changed the icon top here, top left. Sole traders and limited company freelancers, this would be important to you. So keeping records of receipts, keeping records of invoices. I'm just going to show you something which is really slightly old school, actually, because again, it's another spreadsheet, and thankfully the last spreadsheet of the session. But there are software packages that can help you do this, but I wanted to show you this for some freelancers. This is actually a really useful way of keeping records. It's called an income and expense account. And by account here, we don't mean bank account or anything. An income and expense account is a posh name for a list of what you earned and what your business related expenses were. Now, these will be expenses which are tax deductible expenses because you're running a business. I'm going to come out of the slide and I'm just going to show you an example of what it can look like. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail. We don't have time for that. But this is a spreadsheet, again, another template. And at the top, we've got turnover. So this would be where you invoice. You can put in what you invoice for. But what I've also done is I've included all the typical categories of business related expense, which any bookkeeper or accountant would recognize. So these are typical. I didn't make these up. These are, quite typically the ones that would be recognized. And I've also included a description here on the right-hand side of the figures, which describes what each category has in it. That's about the closest I can come to giving a kind of general view of what do we mean by tax deductible expenses. And this is the kind of sheet I find really useful to fill in for 10 minutes at the end of each week, because it just helps me to spot how much money I've got that I've invoiced for, how much I've spent, which gets put there, and one minus the other. So turnover minus expenses brings you your net profit. And that's the figure that gets plugged into a tax calculation. So those are templates you can use. They're all set up and working for you. I've done about 15 years worth of training with freelancers, so I've tweaked them over the years and they always get updated. So what I'm going to give you is a password so that you can always get the most up-to-date version of the stuff online. It's not going to run out. So if we just remind you, keep your records going as you go through the year. All right. So I just want to make that really clear. It's the mantra for me. So you would just do your record keeping as you go along every week. That means you can do your tax return way before the deadline as a result. So there we go. We've covered assessing, estimating, invoicing, organizing, AEIO. Over to you. If you need to find the handouts and templates, this is where you'll get them. I've set up a BFI Future Film Festival section in my client list. I've just put it in there. It's very easy to spot. It's in the course materials page of my website, and your password will simply be handouts. So I hope that's been useful. I've been very keen to make sure that I cover off some of the more business end of things. I'm very, very happy to have questions from you about some of the business stuff. And I'm also sure you'll have other questions as well. So that's it from me. Laura, over to you, and I'm going to have a sip of water.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, David. You definitely gained a few fans today. There's lots of love for your spreadsheets. We've had loads of questions come in, so I'm going to just pick out a few and ask to you. First one's a really tricky one, but I think it would just be really helpful to get both of your opinions on it. So question from Amy: when starting out as a freelancer, should you do any work for free? I think you'll have an opinion on that.
Edie, over to you. I know you want to talk about this.
I always say, Amy, to try really hard not to work for free. And if you're going to work for free, be very clear about why you're working for free and what you're going to get out of it. And I used to work at the National Film and Television School, so I always used to tell my students to try very, very hard not to work for free, because I think once you get on that treadmill, it's very hard to get off of it again. And You know what I mean? And I think sometimes it's really interesting. And I certainly did a bit of work for free when I started out, but I really, really caution about getting on that treadmill.
I'd agree with that. Just to add another thing, I think it's very bad for your frame of mind and your self-worth after a while. And it also undermines the fact that you've got skills that someone needs. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing the work. So why are you giving them that sort of stuff for free? So Amy, I would caution against it. There are actually probably 3 areas I think I could argue you might either drop your price or work for free, but it'd be very, very rare. And I can't really think of a reason why you would take on these. But one of them would be that you're actually going to literally gain a new skill, something specific from doing it. But you have to be really honest with yourself whether that's true or not. Sometimes you can tell yourself you're going to get new skills, but actually you don't learn anything new, in which case it's been a waste of your time. The other reason is maybe you're going to meet some really important people in the job and you think, well, I could invest in this a little bit by doing it for a lesser fee. But even that's very rare. The third thing is you're giving it away, and sometimes you want to do that for charities. Yeah, give it away to a charity. But don't give it away to people who should be paying you.
Got a good question from Ali that follows on from that nicely, kind of around self-worth. And they want to know, what is the best way of determining your own fee? Because it's really easy to undervalue yourself.
So there's lots of very good information out there, Ali, and I don't know what you actually do, but if it's a runner, try to join the myriad of runner Facebook groups. Look at BEC2, which is the union that covers a lot of the technical side of television and other sides of television as well. They publish a rate card, and just try to estimate, look at things like, does this production have a big budget? Is this a feature film? Is everybody else making, good money? And make sure that you're asking your mates. So the great thing about being part of these Facebook groups, I think, is being able to say, I've been offered X amount for a day's work. Does that sound about right? And you'll have lots of people who will come back and help you and tell you whether it's too low, too high, or, spot on. And I think it's really important to do that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't have much to add to that. I think Facebook, I'm not a massive fan of Facebook, actually, funnily enough, but the Facebook groups have come into their own for freelancers. Every job role has its own Facebook group, and you'll learn a huge amount there.
Perfect. So next we've got a question from Sarah, which is probably one for you, David. Sarah wants to know, how as a freelancer do you collect a pension, or perhaps do you save for a pension?
Okay, so I'm not a pensions advisor or a specialist, but I have got some answers for this. So if you're talking about how does a freelancer put into a pension, there are a couple of different ways. One way is just to set up a pension of your own and get some advice from a proper pensions advisor on where to get the best pension. You can do that. They're sometimes called self-invested or personal pensions. And you can literally have a pot and it sits there, and you can put money in either a bit every month, or you can put some in when you can, or if you can't, you don't, and that's a really good habit to get into. And it sits there then until you get to a certain age. And the earlier you do it, the more beneficial that can be. So just putting a little bit in every month, for example, is a great habit. But by the time you get to the age of 60 or 65, you'll really thank yourself for that. So that's one thing. You can just set it up for yourself. You can get some pensions advice from unions, by the way. If you're a member of BEC2, the production union, I know for a fact they have a pensions person there, and they may be able to give you some advice on one way and ways of doing it. There's one other thing I want to say about pensions. If you're a PAYE freelancer, it is perfectly possible that because of the rules around paying people through payrolls, you might actually have some of your income given into a pension pot, put into a pension pot, along with a bit of money from the employer. And that's called the auto-enroll pension system. A lot of freelancers I work with who are PAYE, when they start their careers, they're doing a bit of job there, a bit of job here, a bit of job there, all with different people employing them. They discover that each one has been putting money aside for them in their own pension system. So you could end up with having lots of different pension pots all over the place. Now, it can be worth bringing them all together in one place. I think the key thing is just to make sure you know that that has happened. So if you ever work PAYE and someone sends you an email which seems to be about pensions, don't just bin it. It's probably important, and it's probably telling you where your money's going for when you're later in life. I hope that's given you a bit of a...
That's really helpful, thank you. Got a question from Gemma. Do production companies tend to have a preference on who they take on with regard to PAY freelancers, sole traders, etc.? Would they prefer a candidate who was a freelancer over another one, do you think?
I can answer that. If it's a more kind of starter job role, and I'm presuming that given the film festival is aimed at people starting their careers, I would imagine that might be more relevant. The chances are that you won't be allowed to be paid any other way than through the payroll. So although I have talked there today a lot about the other types of freelancer, particularly sole trader freelancers, actually, in reality, when you start your career, it's very, very likely that if you're going for an interview at an organization, they'll put you on a PAYE contract of some sort, or at least give you work through the payroll, PAYE. In which case you don't have a choice. And in fact, the more junior roles aren't even allowed to be paid any other way. So there are job roles, the more junior ones have to be paid PAYE. You can't even do them as a sole trader. That would not be allowed.
Brilliant, really good to know. I've got a question from Marek, which is probably one for Edie. So if you are a new freelancer, what is the best way of kind of starting out and managing your career, knowing which contracts to take, how to look for contracts, etc.?
I think when you're starting out, it's just really important to, as much as you possibly can, and this will help you sort of set your CV up, it'll help you think about sort of planning work going forwards, is thinking about sort of who you want to work, who you want to work for, who's hiring is probably most important. A really good source of information is the Screen Skills website, and I'm sure Laura's team could put that up. But the Screen Skills website has lots of very good entry points for people and has lots of information about traineeships, and that's a really kind of useful thing to look at. And I think always making sure that you have an up-to-date CV and letting people know that you're actually looking for work and the type of work that you're looking for. I try to help lots of people, but I can never help somebody who says, I don't really know what I want to do, here's my CV. So if you want to be a runner, if you're happy to start as a runner, and that's where, if you want to be a runner in the art department, say that really clearly on your CV so that I know what you're looking for and how to find you.
Another one where those Facebook groups are really helpful as
yes.
well, isn't it?
It is.
There's something else which is about being looked for online. I know that Edie is fantastic at CV advice, by the way, and that's not my forte. But on some of my training that I do around networking, we talk about the importance of online presence. And LinkedIn, although LinkedIn wouldn't necessarily for many people be the way that you would do most of your contact making, LinkedIn is not a bad place to put yourself because it gets very highly indexed by search engines. So if someone is trying to find out a bit about you and they've heard your name or met you at a party, they might Google you because you do that to everybody else. They're doing it to you, of course. So you stick that in. And if your LinkedIn is well written, it'll actually come up with the kind of work you're looking for. But don't confuse LinkedIn with a CV. A CV is very good on what skills you've developed and the jobs you've done. A LinkedIn needs to feel more like, this is where I'm headed. This is the stuff that I need to do now. And this is what I can do to help you. So it's a bit more personal. And it's something which can be very helpful, kind of like an online business card almost as well.
There's a lot of film and TV people, senior people that are very active on LinkedIn as well, who are
very
good
much
to follow, and they're obviously posting jobs and new things coming out of their companies. So even though it's not sort of perfect for film and TV, it is good to have presence on there. David, I've got one for you from Gareth. So Gareth's asking, in reference to tax returns, if you don't earn as much as you estimated that you would, can you get your money back?
Yes.
And sometimes very quickly, David. I got the money back for my daughter last year and it came almost within a week or two.
It would. If the tax office computer notices that you have been overtaxed, it should pay you back certainly within, well, I'm going to talk generally here. And I'm going to come back to a point I made to reinforce one of my learning points from earlier. If you do a tax return really, really early, so if you go through a tax year and you do a tax return, and you put in any information there just at the end of the tax year after it's finished, at that point, the tax office already knows exactly what happened in the previous year. So they will send you any rebate really quickly. So that would certainly be important for a sole trader. Your question, Gareth, rather implies that you're talking about PAYE, where you may have had emergency tax. And emergency tax should come back to you automatically because the tax office already knows about you, but they can't send it until the end of the year because they have to look at the whole year before they know how much to send you back. So I hope that wasn't too convoluted.
No, that's great. And it sounds like, so it's not actually something that you should actively have to go and ask for.
Well, to be honest, Laura, some people find they have to nudge the tax office. And so don't be afraid. And one other thought on tax office. I mentioned helplines and things. Make the tax office your friend. They're not your enemy. Sometimes we talk about tax as if it's to be avoided at all times. No, you pay your tax because that's what, keeps my daughter at university or school or pays for the hospital or, whatever it is. So tax is important. But also the tax office people are really helpful on the helpline. When you get through to them, they're sometimes difficult to get through to because you have to wait a bit. But please do get in touch with them if you have a query. And if you think you've been overtaxed, get them to explain to you why they're wrong or you're wrong.
Brilliant. Okay, and I've got a really great question from Ruby, which probably touches on things that we haven't covered in this session, but I think important to understand. So as an independent filmmaker, how do you then go on to properly employ others? Do you need to set up as a limited company? So if you want to employ people on your film, how do you do that?
Probably yes. Edie, I suspect you have a view on this. I mean, if you're going to literally employ people, I think it would be very dangerous to do that in any other way than as a limited company structure. And that's because the risks around employment law and having responsibility as an employer are so great. You literally can do it as a sole trader, but I've never met anybody who would. I mean, I think limited company is the only way to go on that. The other thing to think about, though, because you used the word employ, I'm just going to flag up when sometimes when people ask me about employing other people, what they really mean is subcontracting. There's a difference between the two things. So, for example, let's imagine that you were working on a production and you were in charge of it and you wanted to bring in a sound person for a day. It is possible if they were a senior sound person that you would actually pay them for the day, but they would invoice you. They wouldn't actually be your employee. That is something that could happen. So that means they're responsible for their own taxes, for example. But the tenor of your question was about employment. And if you were employing people more directly and they were working for you on your payroll, yes, limited company, surely the way to go.
I think you're right. Probably quite a lot of people listening to this, it probably would be more of a case of getting somebody to invoice for their skills as part of a film project. Is there anywhere where people can find out a bit more information on how to do that?
I was going to say, Edie, do you know anywhere specific? I've got a template which won't surprise you. But I always say get the agreements in writing. So make sure that if you are bringing someone in as a subcontractor, so you're going to say, could you do this for a few days and invoice me? Make sure it's a job that they're allowed to do self-employed. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is make sure in writing, you're telling them that they're in charge of their own taxes, making it really clear. And I know this sounds a little heavy-handed, but it's not. Particularly if you're going to work with a friend, you need to get it in writing so that you know where you both stand. You do not want to fall out with a friend because you were both confused about who was doing the tax. That would be awful. So anything else, Edie, that you can think of that would help with that?
David, the other thing is that if you're actually working in film, you really need, I'm sure you know this, but you really need to watch your insurance if somebody is actually sort of a subcontractor, as David said, or whether actually somebody is employed by you, and be really careful of that, because that will really harm your insurance and their insurance. And if you, that's why I quite like being a limited company, because then lots of other things flow into place. But be very careful that you are taking responsibility for people. It's not just about employing them, one day as a sound recordist. It's about sort of all of the other things on top of that to be very careful about.
Yeah,
really good point. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask one final question, which I think is a really good one from Becca. She wanted to know what's the best advice to manage if you're doing freelance work alongside doing a 9-to-5 kind of other PAYE job. How do you kind of manage them both?
David.
You've mentioned the word tax there. So that's going to come to me, isn't it? So yeah, it's very common, by the way. It is extremely common that people operate like that you have a part-time job and then you do freelancing alongside it. So Becca, great question. It's very easy, actually. I mean, if you're working PAYE, then the employer does your tax for you. Keep your pay slips, perhaps even keep a record of them in the way I showed you, but just make sure you keep those. But that should all happen automatically. If you're also a sole trader, so if you're registered as a sole trader, and I think that's what you meant in your question, Becca, just make sure you realize that that's a separate thing and keep the record separate for that. So this is where that spreadsheet I ended with can be quite useful, because it reminds you that as a sole trader, you have turnover as a sole trader and expenses as a sole trader. That's completely separate from any PAYE income. Don't mix them up ever. There are two separate places on a tax return where that happens, but that means that you can keep in touch with that. And at the end of the year, when you do a tax return, the computer will look and work out, the tax office works out how much have you paid in tax already and how much more do you owe based on any earnings that you might have had as a profit as a sole trader.
And don't forget, both of them are income, Becca. Do you know what I mean? So I've had lots of friends who did a bit of freelancing on the side and somehow think that they're not responsible for paying the tax. And unfortunately, Becca, it just is, it is also taxable income and will add to your sort of, your overall tax. So just be careful about that. Save for it as well.
Yeah, if you're paid PAYE for a job and you're a sole trader, the PAYE income and the profit get put into the same pot to work out how much tax you owe. So none of it is tax-free, except for the first few thousand, of course, but that's different. That's for a different course.
Perfect. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. Huge apologies to anyone who asked a question that we didn't get to put to Edie and David. We just had so many questions that we ran out of time. I'm sure everybody in the audience will echo me in saying a huge thank you to you both. That was just absolutely amazing. I think you're going to have lots of people rushing straight to your website, David, and downloading those awesome spreadsheets. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to everybody who's come and joined us this afternoon. We really hope that you'll join us for more events in the Future Film Festival. Our next event is Calling All Directors. Let's talk about production company representation versus working independently, which is in collaboration with Some Such and taking place at 4 p.m. today. Very relevant off the back of this discussion, I think. You can sign up via our website. I think Fiona's posted the link to that in the chat box. I've also seen Fiona has posted our festival survey. Your responses to those surveys really help us improve future events and help us to keep all these events free for you to attend. So please do just take that couple of minutes to respond to the festival survey and give us some feedback. And that's it from me. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.